doesn't know that you're being recorded for this part.
Okay. I remember the first ever meetup I went to, I talked to Riaz. I don't even know if he remembers this, but this is like 2015, 2016. And I very vividly remember the conversation about once you get like a firm grasp on the language, like then you can actually start solving problems with it. But until you get to that point, it's really like you just have to build up learning the language. And so I spent a year doing that off and on because I was employed in the private equity industry at the time. But yeah, so yeah, this I've been a part of the meetup group since 2015, 2016, back when they were still having their meetup, when you guys were having the meetups at Tech Square. So that's how long it's been for me. But yeah, so I work at I guess I can introduce myself. I work at a company called LoadUp. Riaz is our outbound CTO that won't leave. I'm just kidding. He's been contracting with us for the last couple months. Still working. He obviously, with the experience that he has in the code base, it's an invaluable resource. Nico joined us in, what was it, March? So yeah, we've got a couple people here all working with LoadUp. We're actively expanding the business side, and hopefully the development side follows soon. As the business grows, we have more and more complex features that need to be implemented, and just some of the stuff is becoming to the point where the backlog is growing and the feature request list is growing, and the engineering team is not. So there's going to be a breaking point at some point. So yeah, I've been at LoadUp since 2019. I joined I think I'm almost to 2 years in about a week, in May of 2019. So it's been a wild ride. It's a great company to work for. I love the people that I work with, and I love the things that I work on. And those are the two things I've always asked for. So I'm going to share my screen. I did work on a slide deck. Let me see if I can do this correctly. Let's do entire screen. All right. Can you guys see?
I see Hotwire.
Yep.
All right, cool. I changed the
was
title.
muted. I said I see Hotwire, so yes. I see it.
So yeah, Hotwire, if you guys are unfamiliar, is the new, it's still technically in beta. It's kind of the grouping of libraries and gems that Basecamp kind of announced about 6 months ago, I think. It includes like Turbo, which is I guess the successor to Turbo Links, which if you've done JavaScript with Rails for a long time, you've probably had some experience with Turbo Links. And then there's Turbo Rails, which is a kind of a gem that works with Turbo Links using sockets to kind of replace HTML on the page. And I'll get kind of a little bit more into like what the gem does and how it works as we go on. But yeah, so SPAs are so 2020, and 2020 sucked, right? I'm sure we can all agree that 2020 was not the most ideal of years. For me personally, it wasn't totally a terrible experience. This is my daughter Easton. She's going to be 10 months old in about a week, so wasn't the total worst year, but it was very stressful for me personally. Me and my wife Elizabeth, we bought a house, sold a condo, had a child, spent some time in the hospital, and all this while a global pandemic was going on. So 2021 thus far has been much, much better.
Fantastic timing for those changes in life.
Yeah, I know, right? So yeah, 2020 wasn't the worst, but as as the industry like grows and evolves, generally a lot of I won't say I'm an industry expert in any way, shape, or form, and I am definitely not a Hotwire expert either. So there's probably going to be, if there's questions, I'm not going to know a lot of the answers. But in my time as a developer, like I found a lot of the industry is kind of moving towards these what they're calling modern best practices, which I don't know if it's true or not. I don't have direct experience with more than like 3 or 4 companies, but I have noticed like the chatter of the industry definitely has moved over time to a very dynamic JavaScript front end with React, Vue, Angular. Those are kind of the 3 big ones right now, and then like an API backend. Whether it's Rails, Node, Go, Django. There's PHP Laravel that you can do this with. Pretty much anything that can serve a JSON response can serve as a backend. I've seen a lot of articles about people using like serverless functions or even just like static JSON that is interpolated based on the parameters. So it can go anywhere from like the most basic to the most complicated. So like this, these best practices do have benefits. I'm not going to read the slides to you, but generally a lot of the solutions that came about with JavaScript, like kind of splitting the front end into the back end, came about just at these large companies like Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft. Companies that really needed like they had thousands of engineers and really needed to kind of like silo them in certain ways. And so they came up with, ways to present more and more complicated, user experience with more and more isolation. And so there are benefits, but there are drawbacks. And I think this is especially true at smaller companies. LoadUp, we have a total of 5 full-time engineers and Riaz part-time. So like with a small team, like the context of the system becomes kind of challenging to keep all in one person's head or even one small team's head at the same time, especially when you're working in different frameworks on different servers with different tools. So some of the drawbacks there, obviously, like, if you're writing a form and you want to show validation, generally it's a good practice to validate on the inputs and on the server processing. So if you want to provide a good user experience, you have to validate the state twice. And then, we've found on our small team that like in true end-to-end testing with a front end and a back end is difficult. Obviously, like you can test the back end, in isolation pretty well. You can test the front end in isolation pretty well, but actually the feature test, which, I've found to be one of the most valuable parts of the testing pyramid is the feature test. Even though some people consider it way at the top, I think it's very valuable because you only have to write that test once. And then like, you can change the implementation of things behind the scenes a lot. And generally, as long as the feature test pass, you have pretty high confidence that what you've changed, continues working over time. I think the biggest problem, at least that I've seen, is just as a front end grows, the lines and lines of JavaScript grow, and then the compilation step grows. Oh, sorry, that was Kilroy, by the way. So, I think a lot of companies are seeing nowadays that like they've spent a lot of time investing in React, Vue, Angular, and they're just seeing why is it taking 30 minutes to deploy to production? Now, there's a lot of like work going on with different bundlers, different compilers that are providing a lot of benefit there, but it still doesn't really eliminate the problem that like you are running this JavaScript code on any number of 1,000 different versions of browsers. And so like you have to write code that compiles and runs on all those browsers. And so, yeah, I think that's obvious. For me, I'm much more of a backend guy. So like this JavaScript compilation, if that comes up, I will volunteer last to try to solve that problem. And that's more of a personal thing, but man, it's one of those things that like, it is a necessary step of having a JavaScript front end that you're going to have a large compilation step, unless you've spent a lot of time optimizing. So, is there a better way to do this? I think, a lot of what I'm talking about today is very colored by my personal experiences on teams I've worked on, which have mostly been less than 10 people, mostly been on, I wouldn't say small projects, but projects that are pretty tightly scoped and tightly focused. And, not a great amount of surface area given like the amount of surface area that you can cover. So I will say that, if I say that I think this is a better way, it's a subjective statement. But the things that I think are not subjective are the fact that the JavaScript ecosystem moves at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Things are always changing. Things are, there's always, we have a guy on the team who always calls it the new hotness. And I think that brings with it a lot of ecosystem fatigue. I really do enjoy writing React code, but I cannot read React articles anymore because there are 1,000 different ways to do it. Everybody has their opinions and everybody thinks their opinion is better than everyone else's. So, I've spent a lot of time writing React code and then wanting to immediately rewrite it. Just because, I think part of that's because, as a developer, you always think you can do better, but also part of it is because you read an article on Medium that, oh, I never thought of doing it this way. I'm going to rewrite the whole thing to do it this way. So I think doing that over time leads to a lot of fatigue. Now, obviously, you can do the same thing in Ruby. You can do the same thing in any language. I just think based on the number of JavaScript developers out there, the number of articles out there, you see it a lot more in the JavaScript ecosystem. And this is not an anti-JavaScript talk. I know Josh is here, so I have to tread lightly. But no, I think you really can't be a modern full stack developer and not know JavaScript plus one other language nowadays. So better words.
I try really hard not to touch JavaScript, but I do resort to paying other people to touch JavaScript for me.
Well, I'm a huge fan of Stimulus. I'm a huge fan, like I said, of React itself. I've written a lot of React in my career, but it's one of those things. It's like after I've written about 2 or 3 months worth of React, I'm ready to move back to Ruby just because it makes more sense to me. So like the last kind of like drawback of this, front end, back end is there's the feedback loop can be very, very slow. You're working on something that like you're working with a set API, or you have to make a change that changes the front end and the back end. You're kind of doing double work in some cases to like, we were accepting this input was valid, but we want to restrict that. Well, now we have to restrict it on the front end and the back end. It really slows down the feedback loop. And then it also, if you don't have the M1 Mac, it's probably with Webpacker, Rails, maybe a background job processor running, it's going to absolutely chew up your CPU at all times, especially if you're running debug tools. So, I've just found that, writing more and more JavaScript really, really slows down this feedback loop. And, I can kind of get into like my personal beliefs as a developer, as a leader on our team is really something that along the lines of like, I want to see results as fast as possible because I can now iterate as fast as possible. I think there's been research done saying like, if you spend more than 15 seconds waiting on a task, you've already completely forgotten it. So, I think a lot of times if you can push a button, see results, within 2 or 3 seconds, like obviously we're not writing a statically compiled code with Ruby. But, unless you're trying to run your full test suite on every code change, I think a lot of times you can get really rapid feedback from your test suite if you keep it in the Java or in the Ruby ecosystem versus like introducing Java means you have to be running a Capybara in an RSpec if you're running RSpec, which now you have to boot up a web browser in the background. Now you have to, assert your test, you get weird errors. So I've just found like this two-party system essentially is really bad for the rapid feedback loop. So enter HTML over the wire. I don't really know much about the history of HTML over the wire. I'm sure it's something that somebody else in the group can probably give a much more detailed historical background. Like my knowledge of it, it doesn't extend more than 1 or 2 years into the past. When I first saw the Elixir Phoenix live view, where they were generating HTML, shipping it to the browser, and replacing pieces of the DOM within like literal nanoseconds in a local environment. And I thought, holy crap! Like if you can ship code, or you can ship HTML over the wire, get it to the browser, and be manipulating the DOM within ultimately nanoseconds or milliseconds. Like it really provides a user experience that is you can't really differentiate it from that of a native or pure JavaScript in the browser solution. So I first saw it with Elixir Phoenix. I know there's a PHP Laravel that calls it the same thing, live view, and then Ruby on Rails, DHH decided to call it Hotwire because it has to be very clever in how he names things, and also he can't. Actually, you know what? I'm going to leave that joke on the table because we will get into the whole DHH thing later. I've put in a slide if we want to talk about Basecamp later. HTML over the wire really is one of the things that I am personally very excited about in the ecosystem. I know our team is very excited about it as well, because it really opens up a lot of potential avenues for us to really provide seamless, slick user experiences with minimal JavaScript. Now, I'll get into some slides later that kind of explain the drawbacks that I've found with it. But I think for now, I will go into demo time. So I'm going to switch over to VS Code. I have a URL that I can share with everybody if you want to see the little tiny thing I built. But let me, how do I share? Where's the chat? There it is. So it's just a little URL that's pointing to my local machine here. So if you see my computer slow down, that's why. What this is here is just an example. It's tic-tac-toe. You sign in and you set up a game, and now we can play tic-tac-toe right here. All of this is happening over the wire. So let's see, where do I want to go here? Tic-tac-toe is a solved games. Oh, darn it. 20 seconds per minute. Okay. So I did not load test this implementation here. But I can kind of go through the code of what it is. So the way that you install Hotwire is you can either install a gem called Hotwire Rails, run the initializer, and it will install the JavaScript and the Ruby as needed. Or you can install Turbo Rails and Turbo Links independently, which is probably something that if you're trying to implement Hotwire on a larger project and you have any Turbo Links, you're going to have to do, because you do need to modify all the Turbo Links call sites to reference a different constant now. But we're, as a team, we're kind of waiting on Turbo Links to get out of beta, the new Turbo to get out of beta before we kind of go down that path. But yeah, so like I explained in the beginning, explained the whole purpose, the way that you implement Hotwire in your Rails app is two parts. One is the gem Turbo Rails, and the other one is the JavaScript library. So if you look at my gem file, you can see I've just done the Hotwire Rails here, but it also installs in my package JSON Hotwired Turbo Rails, which is the new version of Turbo Links. So this is this runs through Webpacker in this specific instance, and every time I change a JavaScript file, recompiles, but it is shipping this library alongside it. And so the way that you set it up is actually incredibly simple. You don't have to make any configuration changes. The only dependency that they don't include is Redis, which is, I think, just their default built-in pub sub mechanism. So sending HTML over the wire involves a socket connection. A very popular way to do that is Redis offers a pub sub solution, which is essentially just a cache that you pop something on, it sends it out to whoever's listening, and then they also can send responses back. This specific implementation doesn't have any client published changes through the socket layer. It's all HTTP, but this is something that we are pushing the changes out over the wire through sockets here. A real quick tour with tic-tac-toe. It's obviously, there's a game, has many players, has many squares. Each square has, it belongs to a game, belongs to a player optional. This is all just a bunch of logic to make tic-tac-toe actually work. So here's some scopes to help with solving. Player just belongs to a game, and then the game has, it makes sure there's not more than two players, finds a player or finds a game if you sign in, determines who's the next turn, and then all this is to solve. So the model layer is actually pretty boring here. The real interesting part in each one of these is this broadcasts keyword. So broadcast is kind of like one of those Rails magic shortcuts, which says anytime this game changes, send out a new version of myself to anyone listening over the wire. So if I go in here, I do reload, and I just do game.last.touch. Like you can see, it does a lot more than just update the record. So it updates the record, commits a transaction, and then you see this enqueued TurboStreams action broadcast job. So what that does is it essentially finds anybody who's listening, and I'll show you how we set up a listener here in a minute. It finds any listener and determines what action they're doing. So and you define all this through the listener. What the target is, which is in this case just the GID of the game, and then whatever the locals are. And so all this is kind of like, essentially what's happening is Rails Hotwire is running a renderer on the server to generate HTML output, and then it is broadcasting that HTML to anyone who's listening. And you can see, like here, this is the partial that I have it set up with. So it's kind of cool that like anytime a record changes, if you have this broadcasts inside of here, it will automatically broadcast. Now you can actually, I don't have it off. I would have to look it up, but there are several different, like this essentially is kind of like a catch-all. It's kind of one of those things like, honestly, if we were to bring Hotwire in at load up, we would probably not do it this way because we generally don't like to do this kind of acts like an active record callback. But this is really an easy way if you're working on something simple to immediately set up a broadcaster. And so like you can get a little bit more granular. You can specify based on conditions, like what partials you want to update. Do you want to add some potential like locals? Do you want to, add some conditional rendering logic? You can do a lot of that through the more granular options for broadcasting. But like I said, this is really just a very simple way to link the game to through Hotwire to what's going on to the page. So now if I go down to the views and look at this partial, you can see how I've set up the turbo listener. And so the way that I think about this is like with these turbo streams, and I'll get into turbo streams in a second, but turbo stream kind of wraps a turbo frame. with the turbo streams, like I think of this as like an entry point in the code that says like, okay, anything inside this turbo frame, anytime there's a change in this, and I'm just passing the model game here. But the way that turbo frame works is it essentially says, okay, does game respond to two keys? If so, return the DOM ID. Otherwise, just return the string if you pass a string. In all active record objects, you can just do this and it'll actually output the DOM ID. And I can show you that. But essentially, anytime this game, anytime there's an open connection on a web page that has this turbo frame, and I see a message that says game with this specific ID, like re-render this, or you can do a append, or you can do a prepend, or you can do a delete, or there's a couple different options on how you can potentially how you want the DOM to mutate over time. But essentially you wrap what you're trying to change inside this turbo frame, and it's just intuitively automatically hooked up. Because you're passing in the model, like you can really not even think about what you need to name it, not really think much about like how you're going to broadcast it. And it really is an intuitive way to set up a part of the page that listens for broadcasted changes. And so I talked about turbo streams. What you do have to do is somewhere up in the page. So you're seeing here, I'm just rendering this partial that I just showed you, but above it in the page, I'm saying turbo stream from game. So this is where I actually set up the listener portion. So like the game is where it happens, and the stream is like what I'm listening for. So in this case, I have access to the instance variable because this is a show page. And here I don't have access to the instance variables, and I'll get into that a little bit. So I'm just listening for the variable game versus here it's the instance variable. But yeah, so that's literally all you have to do is this turbo stream from a model and then turbo frame tag around it. And so before my ngrok server died, hopefully you guys could see that actually I think, yeah, that's fine. So a lot of, like I said, this, it's radically simple. It's something that definitely fits within like the way that Rails typically does things, is like make it super simple, make it, give options for shelling out to more complex solutions, but make the base use case very simple. And so that's why I think, something like this, over time, best practices will emerge over time. Potential, edge cases or, performance issues will be solved. But, I think it's so simple, so dead simple right now to broadcast a change from your server, set up a listener on a web page, and, set up a block that you can replace. That it's literally 3 lines of code, broadcasts, turbo frame tag, and turbo stream tag, and you immediately have a completely responsive system. So, I'm obviously kind of painting this with rose-colored glasses. There are some drawbacks, but I can. So that kind of ends the demo portion. I mean, it's super simple. Like I have changed nothing about assets, channels. I built some controllers, but the controllers don't have anything to do with turbo links. They're just simple Rails controllers, no helpers. I didn't have to modify the JavaScript directly, but the application JS pack has hotwired turbo Rails in it. That's from the initializer. I haven't built any stimulus controllers. I mean, I'm dead serious. It's 3 lines of code, and I have responsive HTML that can ship updates over the wire. And so maybe if I can give instead of this, I'll just go to localhost and kind of show okay, I've got Firefox here, and I'll go to a Chrome browser here. I was showing my wife how to do this. So this is our local game. She was on Chrome. So here you can see as I click here, it's Elizabeth's turn. This is her screen. So when she clicks it, it immediately shows up on the other side. It's my turn. Boom, I won because she doesn't know how to play tic-tac-toe. So, all this happens over the wire. I mean, I haven't set up any like validations. You can keep doing a lot of this stuff. It's not a perfect tic-tac-toe game, but that's not the point of this presentation today. But it does kind of, provide, so like every time I click on this, it sends a request. And I can actually probably show you this on the inspector in the network tab. So when I click here, you see it sends a post request here. Now, because I'm on this side of the page, I didn't see the WebSocket response. I'm also not a designer, by the way. I'll move this to the bottom so it doesn't do that. Okay. Yeah, like I said, I'm more of a back end guy. But if I'm watching on the network, so I'm just going to get this down and reset the game. Okay, so it's Nick's turn. Over here is Nick's side. You can kind of see as I click here, if I go to the WebSockets, why is it not showing? That's interesting. It's coming across, but it's not showing in here. But when essentially, it's sending a post response to the back end. It's processing the post response, and then it is broadcasting using those 3 lines of code. Broadcast from the model, turbo frame tag around this tic-tac-toe board, and a turbo stream tag that listens. Between those 3 things, like it is 100% like over the wire, fully responsive, fully. I mean, I can't. I'm sitting here staring at it. You guys are over a little bit of a probably lag on connection, but I can't see a delay in between the two. Obviously, running locally, there's no ping or lag here, but yeah, I mean, it's really impressive to me. So I'll stop fawning over it. I think that the utility of the demo expired. Did anybody have any questions up to this point? I'm generally not good at stopping and asking for questions, so I have to remember to do it and be reminded. Three lines. Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things that's like, is it seriously, this is all it takes? It did take me a little bit of time to really understand how they all work together. And hopefully I kind of explained my understanding of which each one of those lines of code does. But once I got that, I mean, it's just immediate, like, oh, I know I'm broadcasting. I know I'm listening on the page, and I know that I'm replacing anything with this DOM ID.
So, yeah, I have a question about listeners.
Mm-hmm.
What is a listener? Is a listener each individual client, or is it a listener represent a portion of the page that you designated as the Hotwire area of the code?
So it's really a mixture of the two. So for instance, I could have, on here put something along the lines of like, if I wanted to show all the different games, I could set up a TurboStream listener for, game.all, which will set up all the different, it'll set up a listener for each game. I'd have to iterate, I'd have to do game.all.each do, TurboStream listener, whatever. But what it would do is any changes in those games would also get broadcast. So this broadcasting sends these messages over the wire, and then you, quote unquote, the client is responsible for picking out the streams that it wants to listen to. So like that turbo stream tag, because it said turbo stream game, I guess I can go back to the code to kind of point out what I'm talking about. Why is it so small? Okay.
So by terrible networking analogy, would you say that it's a hub, not a switch?
You've already lost me, man. I have no idea. I'm not a networking guy. But
hubs used to send all packets to all computers on the network, whereas switches will discriminate and only send traffic that's destined to a particular host to it.
Yeah, so what this turbo, I think I understand what you're saying. I would say this is client-driven switch. So when this page loads, I set up this. So actually, I can show you this in the console here. When this page loads, I'm just gonna get a bunch of space here so you can see exactly what happens. Sorry about this. When this page loads, you can see it actually sends a message and it says Turbo Streams channel is transmitting to the subscription confirmation, and it has a unique ID for the subscription. So when this page loads, Rails runs through and says, okay, I'm Turbo Stream from game. And so what it does is it sets up a network call. So if I reload and show, like, I don't know if it's going to show the WebSocket one. Yeah. So here you can see it's switching protocols. This is switching protocol. They're all okay. I'm not sure which one is doing it directly, but one of these WebSocket calls is actually sending a message back. Hey, I've loaded. Hey, my browser says I should be listening for this specific stream. So it sounds a little bit more like a switch in the analogy you gave, but essentially each one is uniquely set up. So now anytime something in the back end,
Everything subscribed to that channel ID will get
yes.
all the messages. The security of it is who gets to know about that particular channel ID.
Right. So if I'm logged on to another page, I don't get updates from, this is game 13. Like if game 14 or 15 changes, like I'm not going to see WebSocket messages here. It's only going to send messages to anyone who's subscribed to game 13.
Makes sense.
I bet you, this is just coming from the action cable side of things. I bet you that you would be able to cross over the subscription and throw them into like a notification box up top. So anytime a game was updated that you were playing, like say you're playing like 5 chess games, there would be a notification box that you could update based on all those subs. Because that's at least how action cable works. If you can create a way that everybody, you're able to, anyway, quickly update that one little box and say like, hey, this game in real time, being sent over the wire, just had a move played, and so you can go and access that. So even if you're like not on the page that you technically have your subscription, I bet you there's a way to continue that subscription, or they're just going to say like you have to do that via action cable if you want to have
Yeah.
interaction.
Nico's just admitted to being a checkers shark on old school Yahoo games. He's like, when you're playing 15 games at a time, just, when it happens.
Yeah, so I bet there's a way to set up a web worker that can initiate this listener, and then the web worker kind of keeps the connection open. I'm not sure if that's how Chrome's protocols work. I'm sure it has something to do with WebSockets, or it could just be the browser sending HTTP calls. I have no idea.
It's probably it's a web. It very likely is a WebSocket, and then from there it's going to be a proxy connection through Nginx or whatever. But yeah, WebSocket, I imagine.
Yeah, so it really kind of opens up the power of WebSockets. I've worked on a project in the past that used WebSockets pretty heavily prior to like a lot of this existing. It was definitely before Anycable, definitely before a lot of this stuff, and it was a lot of like direct manipulation of the Redis cache or the PubSub mechanism. Sorry. And it was a pain in the butt to debug. And I haven't had to do a lot of debugging with this, so I'm not sure whether the experience would be a good one or a bad one. But it does seem like it's pretty well set up in terms of like, I'm controlling all this stuff through, a view and a model, which are the two. This view model controller is the bread and butter of Rails. So it's like we're keeping it inside of that rather than having to do direct manipulation of a Redis connection. So it really seems like a pretty powerful abstraction over that. And it provides a lot of stuff that you can do, like I said, with prepend, append, delete. So yeah, it could. I could definitely see some applications where like, oh, I want to set up like actual web notifications or Chrome notifications. Nobody actually wants to do that. I don't know anybody that willingly says, yes, I'd like to subscribe to your blog and get notifications and interrupt me in the middle of my workday. But yeah, it is entirely possible, I think, to do it through web worker. I think that'd be something to explore.
One point about that you made, Frank, with the security, I think you are onto something there. And, let me paint this scenario where you have a blog post, and within this blog post, you accept a bunch of different comments. Typically, if I create a comment, I should be able to edit it or to remove that comment. But if I make that comment and then with Turbo, it just broadcasts it out to everybody. If I'm using some logic within my partial, like if this blog post comment user is equal to current user, and then show the edit button or the delete button, well, it's not going to rerun all that logic once it gets to the client computer, because it's already rendered the HTML and it's already determined that I am the blog post comment owner. So you're basically going to broadcast that edit and delete button to everybody. So you do have to be careful whenever you are doing these kind of simple broadcasts, because you could essentially have a UI issue where you're pushing out elements that you did not mean to. And I think that's where something like a React or Angular or any of the other JavaScript frameworks, or even just doing it the plain old vanilla Rails way, makes this a little bit easier to handle those situations, because it's not a here's what I want to broadcast to everybody. So
yeah, you can have the same thing that happens. I'm sorry, please finish, Dave.
Yeah, so it's just one of those things that you have to keep in mind when you are doing these. And I think that's where Turbo kind of has a downfall, because once you deviate from everybody who is subscribed to this channel should get the whole message, it gets more complicated.
Yeah, it's kind of like turning on caching, active cache, action cache.
Yeah.
And then you like leak information through your cache because you weren't very cautious about what your cache key was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I kind of, I guess like the benefits, I kind of already went over a lot of these. The big ones are really like the Turbo Frame and Turbo Stream, providing a lot of intuitivity to this. But yeah, that is one of the drawbacks, is the broadcast HTML updates are run outside of the global context. So when Rails renders that partial and sends it over the wire, it does not have access to the global context. So you can't, like I said, you can't access instance variables, the current module, or devise. I think there's a couple ways to work around this. I saw a couple articles, but I didn't have time to, that recently came up, and I haven't had time to really look into them. But yeah, you would have to kind of work around, for instance, an authorization like Dave described of a comment that I created. I can delete it, I can edit it, but nobody else can. And then, so that's kind of a drawback. The other one is there's only a few DOM replacement tools. Stimulus Reflex is kind of a competitor in this space, and it's been around a little longer. But it uses MorphDOM, which is a JavaScript library behind the scenes. They use, I think, at last count, like 38 or 39 different DOM manipulation mechanisms. And I think over time, obviously, this will probably grow. And then I think the biggest drawback at this stage in May 2020 is like the uncertain future. So like, I guess this is kind of where I kind of opened the, I guess I'm kind of done with the presentation here. The one thing that does worry me, and we've actually talked about this a little bit at work, is Sam Stevenson, the guy who worked at Basecamp and was kind of the lead contributor to this project, is stepping away from Rails core contributor. He's not a core contributor anymore because of all the stuff that happened at Basecamp. There haven't really been any repository changes in the last month or so. Whereas before that, they were pretty actively developing, trying to get this out to a like 1.0 release. So yeah, these are kind of the drawbacks that I found in the time that I was working with it. But yeah, I think if we wanted to, I guess I'll open it. I'm personally like a little concerned about the future of some of the Rails features, just because of the when Rails makes it to the front of the tech page of the Wall Street Journal through DHH, like it's something that your ears typically perk up at. So I'm a little worried about that, but I'm not going anywhere personally. I don't know that anybody that I've talked to is feeling differently about the framework itself, but it is a little concerning that some of the core contributors are having kind of a external fight that is leaking into the development of the project. So yeah, that's the entirety of my presentation. If anybody wanted to ask questions.
I have a question. Many, basically, like any fairly large application ends up developing a design library or UI library of components, and I wonder how that would look like with Hotwire and Stimulus. If there aren't robust tools to build these reusable interactive components with whatever way you choose to share styles, that may be the point where you say, okay, that I need something beyond what Hotwire and Stimulus has to offer.
Yeah, I've been really into Vue components lately, and we've kind of done a lot of work to really like kind of consolidate some of our more common user experience patterns into Vue components. So I'd definitely be curious to see how you can integrate with something like Vue components. I know GitHub has their primer library all through Vue components right now, which is their kind of version of their internal Bootstrap. But yeah, I definitely can see what you're saying in terms of like, if it's running outside of the global context and that's how you define your styles, is through some of the global context. Like, how do you handle that? Like, how do you link the two?
Yeah, like I understand how you can put together a quick form with two-way binding using Hotwire, but like, what if you have need to like put a custom dropdown and a calendar widget, or some more complex components on the page? That how do you define them as reusable components with Hotwire and Stimulus instead of with Vue or React?
Yeah, I mean, at LoadUp, we've done a pretty good amount of work, with web components to try to solve some of that as well. And I know that behind the scenes, the Turbo Frame tag is actually just a web component, as well as the Turbo Stream tag. So, I wish James would have joined us today because he has a lot more to say about web components and Vue components. But I think, personally, I'm very excited about the space because there's just active development and it's not related to, the giant JavaScript bundle that you send across the wire, right? You can use what's built into the browser with, web components with, and then just server rendered pages to really design a really unique interface. I think the problem of like specialized reusable components kind of depends on project to project, company to company. But yeah, I think that's definitely something that teams will have to work on, is like, how do we design some best practices or better practices around reusability of some of this stuff.
Yeah, and I think the ecosystem will need to catch up too, because like, again, if you take Vue or React, there are a lot of, there's the testing library by Ken Dodds that give you a lot of best practices. There are all kinds of linkers that ensure that, you do things in the performance, that your components are accessible. So tools like that would need to be created for this new stack for it to really be successful at scale.
I think what's also kind of interesting was I was remembering an article from Betterment, which is a U.S. sort of company that does sort of like automated robo investing. So they're one of the fastest growing in that space. And they wrote an article back in 2016 where they kind of did this, but they didn't have any of the existing tooling. And so they realized they had like a massive pain point with maintaining two separate applications. And so they ended up having to kind of solve a lot of the problems that Dimitri was talking about by essentially like effectively PJAXing, like AJAXing back and forth for HTML content, and then like triggering events that actually would go to the back end and then respond with markup. And so this seems like a evolution of that to like build it into a more cohesive tool set where you can use like partials and view components and all that stuff, and then decorate them to kind of get your patterns in. I'll put a link to that article. It's kind of fascinating that they were like looking at that back in 2016, and apparently it worked. I think it's the same architecture they use for today.
That's a great point, Riaz. Let me be slightly contrarian or nothing new under the sun guy. So we've been doing this pattern for a long time. I guess, in fact, this pattern predated in many ways Web 2.0, right? We're going to render some stuff. We're going to render a substitution and send it to an iframe. Then we got smart and we had stuff like Rails, which did UJS, which did replacements of like individual divs and stuff with server-side rendered things. How is this different? Is it just that it's nicer syntax and a fewer lines of code, or is there something actually new here?
I think the biggest benefit that I see is definitely the socket implementation. You don't have to do the HTTP handshake on every DOM change you want to push. You do it once with TLS at the socket layer, and it's done. So you're saving a lot in performance. I've seen a lot of websites that, like you said. Thanks, Frank, for giving me the the background. Like I said, I know that we've been doing this for a long time with different patterns. But I think, really kind of shifting our mindset from everything over HTTP to like, we do have WebSockets built into every modern browser. They're pretty well battle tested, and a lot of people use them for a lot of different things. But I think the Rails ecosystem, until Stimulus Reflex, really wasn't using them in some larger libraries over WebSockets. So, I think that's the big difference to me between what we used to do with UJS, what we used to do with, even iframes.
I think the neat thing is it kind of abstracts the explicit client to server interaction. And that's also not an entirely new idea. There have been other approaches to that. But yeah, the selling point is that you really write in one stack, and then the framework handles the interaction between the back end and front end. You don't have to explicitly think about, okay, this is front end code. It has to call the back end, receive the response, parse it, and all that stuff. It is kind of abstracted away from you.
Yeah, I mean, part of what Rails gave us was like, 15-minute blog. We don't have to write our own HTTP layer. We don't have to write our own view renderer. We don't have to do a lot of that stuff. I think this is just another step of like, hey, we're providing a really easy way. Now, obviously, like with everything, there are caveats that with everything, there are like going to be use cases that this doesn't fit, or you have to really shape it to fit. But I think for the basic, use case, I think this is a really good like proof of concept that it's possible to do it in an elegant way with Ruby and Rails.
Right, you get a spa-like experience in Ruby on Rails instead of if you do a traditional Ruby on Rails app, you have this whole page reload thing upon every interaction.
Mm-hmm.
And I got a question for you. So one of the things that is helpful when things kind of go wrong is being able to like go into your JavaScript app and put a bunch of debuggers or console statements. Because so much of it is automatic, is that a challenge that you've kind of hit? Because I've been less involved in the level of implementation on this, that like, okay, there's nowhere to really inspect because it's just sort of all automated machinery.
Yeah, so like because it's all running, it's running through the Ruby process. You can toss a binding pry in a lot of places, in the same way you would toss a debugger. or whatever your debugger in Ruby of choice is. But it does kind of abstract away a lot of the like the actual internals of like how it forms how it renders, how it forms the response and how it parses the request. I haven't tried to dig in to see if there are like easy entry points for that. If you do have something like this should work, but it doesn't, type issues. But I think at least in the Rails layer, I had no problems debugging what was happening there. The one thing that did get me was like I was trying to reference a lot of variables that like the instance variables. That was the big catch for me, was the fact that you couldn't access the instance variables from within the rendering context. But yeah. So actually, I did want to shout out Dave. I watched your Drifting Ruby episode on Hotwire, and it was actually incredibly instructive. So thank you for putting that out. I'll if you wanted to toss a link, you probably have it more readily available than I do.
Yeah, I'll do that. Thanks a lot, man.
So, Nick, you mentioned stimulus reflex a few different times. I'm curious if you or anyone has thoughts on, has compared them and to see like pros and cons between them, and just how they differ.
Yeah, so at LoadUp, we've actually tried to implement stimulus reflex twice now, and it kind of fell into what Riaz was describing. I don't know if this was a leading question or not, Riaz, but we had a ton of trouble at the socket layer. I don't know if there was something just in the documentation we couldn't find, but the problem we had was, our servers run on Heroku, and the Heroku, there are multiple boxes running at the same time. So I think what was happening was we had trouble with like the connection sending and being picked up by the wrong server, and it was not recognizing the connection or failing it, or it would send multiple times because it couldn't recognize which server to send it from. So that was, we have tried to implement stimulus reflex a couple times, and ran into some real implementation issues at the socket layer. But I will say, like, the experience in terms of the like code on the page is a million times better. With stimulus reflex, you have to import it, or not import. We're in Ruby land. You have to set it up. You have to specifically draw out exactly what you're doing. You have to manually set up the broadcasts. It doesn't really have a good like automatic implementation like Hotwire does. And of course, like, that is something that could potentially be, beneficial, or something that people are looking for, is a more explicit approach. But, I would say honestly, at this point in their development, stimulus reflex, the features they provide is a much larger set of features. Like I said, they offer like 38 different ways to morph the DOM. They offer a bunch of different ways to like set up listeners and connections, but it is all manual. So you kind of have to have spent some time poring over the docs and finding exactly what you want to do exactly what you want. Versus this, the experience for me was much, much simpler in terms of setting it up and in terms of getting the changes broadcast to the page.
That's a really helpful contrast. Thank you.
So if everybody's going to be quiet, Nick, you got a feedback loop going.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. I'm just curious. So I posted this to the team. I thought it was kind of interesting. The company Notion is creating a browser that is taking this idea of HTML over the wire, and they're HTML over the wiring everything. So essentially, they've created a way that this browser will handle client interactions with what sounds like, regardless of the language on the back end, they'll process it, they'll interact with your server, and then stream back the HTML updates. Is what it sounds like. I'm just curious, like, how, if anybody sees that this modifies the ecosystem, since we're like the reactive nature is being handled by the browser, or a browser now. If languages consolidate or change, if we come back to everybody's, well, then like, why am I going to do any client side rendering? Because there is no client anymore. It's just a pass through server, and go to more of an edge slash server side rendered kind of architecture. And that's me not knowing enough about this industry. And I'm really curious how it's going to affect things.
Yeah, so specifically, I think you're talking about the thing where it kind of operates and feels like a VM, where like you're not actually running the DOM in your browser. All you are is essentially like subscribing to an interactive video feed, and it streams the pixels back to you. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's my assumption, is that that's how it works. I didn't look into it indefinitely, but essentially a client now is interacting with their browser, right? Even if it's a VM, and having those changes like streamed back and forth.
Do you remember what it was called? I can't remember.
Mighty? It's by the company Notion, our favorite to-do app that we don't use.
I would like to put on my old man hat and just point out that that is exactly what application service providers, ASPs, were in the 90s, was this whole thing to stream GUI applications over the wire instead of running them on your systems. And X11 works the same way. You can, like, right now do SSH-X into another Linux box, run a command, and watch the GUI pop up on your screen. I don't know if you've done that, Nick.
No, I have not.
I have used it a few times. I'm on my laptop, and I'll SSH back down to my desktop here, and I'll be like, damn it. So I'll kill all Firefox and then open up Firefox on my desktop via X11, just to spot check something. But
I feel like the scope of work that we do is very different from you, Riyadh or Frank.
I guess I'm just pointing out when he's talking about streaming content to a dumb terminal, I'm laughing because that's just like so old school. That's all.
That's kind of an interesting thing that we've talked about a lot. Is like, like you said, Frank, there is nothing new under the sun. These are all just rehashes of previous ideas. So I think that's something that's very interesting to me about this, is it's really like taking an idea that like has been very difficult to implement in the past and putting it into a framework that I know pretty well. And so that's, I guess, mostly what is exciting for me, is like I've always wanted to try this, but there's just never been something that was easy enough to use to get into.
So old man curmudgeon Frank,
Yes, sir.
how did this, like, then, the same question applies. Is it just marketing? Is it just time? Like Nick said, is it like easier for people to implement? Are people more accepting of like, this goes back to the whole like mouse being developed when we could do touch screens, like visual interactions.
I mean, the mouse was invented at the same time as the corded keyboard. But you see one and then the other seems really high tech when it shows up again with wearable computers in the 90s. So
what I'm saying is like the things have already been invented, but it was just too far beyond
what's the use for it, right?
Understand to use it. Yeah.
I mean, if you look at what Ajax was created, Ajax in a sense was created by the Internet Explorer team at the request of the Outlook team to make their web version of Outlook. Prior to that, you were on your own in many ways. There was a couple of tricks in native JavaScript where you could do a request back to the same server. But they simplified it in some ways. So, to answer your question, I think some of it is a marketing spin. Like, Rails said, let's make a nice new feature. Let's give it a name. It's kind of like did you have a security vulnerability if it doesn't have a cool name and a domain anymore? It's like, Heartbleed, catches attention. Hotwire sounds a lot cooler than shoving HTML over a socket connection back to your subscribing clients. So it has a name, it has semantics, but I don't want to downplay the fact that it's a library that's easy to use. So they've taken a concept that is not new, they put it in a library, and our framework grew by another available package that we can drop into something. I don't want to say that's a bad thing. I just, my curmudgeonness is like sedate excitement rather than, oh my God, this is so new and amazing, I guess is all I'm saying.
I could be the curmudgeon here. I don't think it's going to go. I mean, I don't think it's going to make it very far, to be honest. I mean, I think Hotwire will be pretty cool, but I think, I like Stimulus Reflex. I think that might be pretty good, but I think it has a limited application. I think the streaming stuff is, I don't think there's any motivation for browser makers to make it any easier for developers to develop applications easier, especially when, you could just do the same thing in React and get pretty decent performance. Right. I sort of see, I think the problem with something like Hotwire is that it doesn't scale very well when you start when your JavaScript assets starts increasing. I think that's the issue with this, is that as you want more interactivity and you want to do more JavaScript, you sort of need to go to a true framework, and you got to go back to your core software development skills, which means, doing well designed, applications and such. And I think that's eventually as long as, we're going to trend that way, I think there's going to be applications for Stimulus for smaller projects, and that makes a lot of sense. But as your application scale, it's just it won't make a lot of sense. It will just be too hard. I mean, I know so many people that, the first thing they do when they do large apps is just uninstall TurboLinks because it screws something up. And I doubt that that's actually going to change with Turbo. Just the underlying nature of how Turbo works. I think it's just, there's some issues there that you have to sort of compromise on.
I always remove Bootsnap. I basically find it useless. And it breaks weird things in Docker. And so it's not fun.
We always remove, or I always remove Spring.
Yeah. I think Calvin has a point. I mean, I don't know that I fully subscribe to it, Calvin. Like I don't think a problem that Hotwire solves, I don't think has a scaling problem. An app can grow beyond the set of problems that it has.
I'm talking about scaling. It's more like development scaling.
Okay.
It's not. Yeah. It's not about scale. It's about that like technical scale. It's more like development scale, right?
I don't want to rope Dave in too hard here, but Dave and I have had previous conversations along the lines of the number of apps that should just be written in plain Ruby without a front end. That it would be better.
Yeah. I am definitely on that side. I'm on your side of the argument in that. But I think like the trend you see now in that.
I guess that would be pure Rails, not pure Ruby.
Yeah,
pure Ruby would be fun, interesting, but
I think the trend you see is going to that dual, dual modality where you have like the client side and the back end side, and the question is this enough to make people want to change? And I don't see that happening, just because there's like benefits to doing more software development on the client side, because you get, you can work with, classes, and you can work with modularity, abstractions, and all that stuff.
We just need to compile Ruby to WASM and just get rid of the JavaScript middleware.
Yeah.
Well, and don't forget that one of the benefits that Hotwire also brings is with Turbo iOS and Turbo Android, making it easier to get your application into a native app with native functionality. It's not very clear cut for a Ruby-only developer. So you do have to know Kotlin, or you have to know Swift in order to make it happen to a realistic native looking app point. but it does help bridge that gap to where you are working on a single code base deploying to multiple platforms.
Yeah.
Ooh, Dave, quick question. Sorry to rope you in. Does that
Nope.
so one of no, it's not doing
He
it.
proved himself in. Push.
How so we are constantly debating that like single code base solution, right? And we always run up to the idea of push notifications to iOS. That is the last step. Does the new way that Turbo is written solve that, or do you still have to work around push notifications to iOS?
Yeah, if you are making, sorry, one of my kids is screaming, crying. I don't know if you can hear that.
No worries.
I don't know what you're talking about. I don't hear kids anymore, Dave.
Yeah, we're all pretty immune to the screaming child syndrome.
Yeah. So I think going native is always going to be the best experience for push notifications. And I think that's just kind of the route you have to go. There are some alternatives with external services that you can subscribe to or something, but it's kind of I haven't fully bought into it.
Thanks.
Yeah, so kind of, I didn't really go into it, but part of what the third part of the Hotwire triangle, I went into TurboLinks, I went into Turbo Rails, but I did not go into, I guess, the thing there used to be called TurboLinks iOS, TurboLinks Android. They're gonna, I guess, do something called Strata, but that it kind of represents kind of the third leg of that, where you're essentially using web views and rendering server pages, and kind of like the iOS and Android layer is incredibly simple. It's just like essentially page navigation and any of the like native modules that you might need to use. There's actually a really interesting Rails with Jason podcast that came out a couple weeks ago with a guy who's done a lot of work with TurboLinks iOS and TurboLinks Android. I don't have a link to it, but I would send that. I need to prepare links next time I give a presentation because I'm not good at that. But yeah, like that's actually something that Nico, you and I have talked about it, in a work context a lot. But it's interesting to me because like, how, is there a way to like create a nice bridge between like, I've developed apps in Ionic before, which is essentially just that. It's running a web page. It has a few like native modules that you can link into, but essentially it's just a web view and it's rendering HTML and JavaScript. And so like, how do you, is there a way to do that with Rails? Because I'm definitely more of a, it's just who I am. Is if asked to build a project, I'm always going to reach for Ruby or Rails first, just because it's the language that I know and love. So is there a way to do something like that? Because I think there's it kind of was brought up where like the developer scaling might be a problem with something like Hotwire. I would agree with you. There are probably 10 React developers on the market for every Rails developer. So like building a team rapidly might be a challenge if one of the patterns that you're expecting people to know is HTML over the wire in a Rails context. But I think you run into that challenge with any type of project that reaches a certain scale.
So are you kidding me? Stop. Okay, let's just take your average JavaScript framework at the rate JavaScript goes. If you stop updating it for 6 months and you hire someone, they're going to act like they've never heard of that framework that you used before.
I didn't say that. I said nothing about the skill or about the speed at which the ecosystem moves. I said the number of React developers is 10-1 to Rails developers. I know this because we've searched for Rails developers and it is very hard.
Okay.
That's like a Rails that's like Riaz compared to a junior, right? Like React developers implement at a certain kind of speed that they can get there. One Rails developer equals a certain amount of React developers.
It depends. I don't know. I've been sucked into some projects, Nico, that are so over the top complicated that I might appear from the outside to move at a snail's pace. Like literally, it's like, is that pull request going to come in anytime? And then when it does, it's fully tested with lots of coverage, and all the edge cases have already been reasoned out, and is, I don't want to say perfect, but you know, there is an engineering quality difference, I think, in some areas. So
team expectation then. You can still, I mean, doing all that in React versus doing all that in Rails.
Well, I would take care to not like, you know, I'm not suggesting that it's like Camp React versus Camp Rails, right? I don't like to make those comparisons because I do love React, right? I've spent a lot of my career doing it, and you know, I tend to think I'm a pretty good React developer. Riaz might disagree because he's reviewed some of my React code in the past, but I always hesitate to try to draw lines in the sand. I think the reason that something like Hotwire is able to exist is because those lines are not drawn in the sand except for anybody's minds. Is because, you know, these ideas have existed for a while, but somebody was like, oh, let me actually do the work to look into how this could fit into a context, design a library that may fit, you know, the way that I know Rail, you know, whoever, you know, Sam Stevenson or DHH or whatever combination of them, how I can design something that fits into those two, you know, fits into what I expect Rails developers will enjoy as a developing experience. So
that's awesome. No, that's good.
Well, I love Ruby, and I'm not going anywhere. And this is Ruby,
hey Ruby,
her daughter.
Hey, Ruby. Hey.
So Nick, does that conclude your presentation?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have anything else to add.
Well, thank you so much for leading the way this time.
No problem.
Seriously. And some good discussion. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording.